Vietnam, January 1968. The jungles near Pleiku were thick and silent, the kind of silence that meant something terrible was coming. Private First Class Dwight H. Johnson, a 23-year-old tank driver from Detroit, sat inside his M48 Patton, his hands resting on the controls, his nerves tuned to every sound beyond the steel hull. He was part of the 1st Battalion, 69th Armor Regiment, young, battle-worn, and tired of pretending not to be afraid. He'd grown up in Detroit's East Side, where fights were part of life and you learned fast or got swallowed whole. He wasn't a born warrior, just a man who wanted to do his job and make it home. But on that gray January morning, the war decided otherwise. Without warning, the jungle erupted. Mortars crashed around the convoy, explosions lifting the ground beneath the tanks, gunfire burst from invisible tree lines tearing into the column. Dwight's tank jolted violently as a shell slammed into its side, flames bursting from the rear. His gunner screamed, "Hit bad!" Smoke filled the turret. Johnson didn't hesitate. He kicked open the hatch, dragged his wounded comrade into the mud, and took cover behind the burning steel. All around him was chaos, men shouting, tanks burning, bullets snapping through the grass. He could have stayed down. Any man would have. But Dwight wasn't any man. He grabbed his M16 and .40 pistol, and without a word, he charged toward the fire. Alone, he sprinted through the smoke, firing bursts into the trees, cutting down enemy soldiers who seemed to appear from nowhere. When his rifle clicked empty, he grabbed another from a fallen comrade. He found a tank crew trapped inside their vehicle, flames rising fast, climbed up, pulled one man out, then another. An explosion threw him back, tearing his sleeve, searing his skin, but he pushed up again. He wasn't done. He ran toward another disabled tank, jumped onto the turret, and manned the .50 caliber gun. The roar of that weapon shattered the jungle, shells falling like rain. He swept the line until the gun smoked and fell silent. When his ammo ran out, he picked up whatever weapon he could find, an AK-47, a grenade, even a bayonet. For over half an hour, Dwight Johnson fought like a man possessed, one soldier against an entire North Vietnamese assault. By the time reinforcements arrived, the enemy had retreated. The field was a wasteland of twisted metal and still bodies. Dwight stood among them, breathing heavy, eyes blank. His tank was gone, his crew dead or wounded, and yet he was still there, alive, though something inside him wasn't. When the medics reached him, he barely spoke. Someone told him he should have died out there. He just nodded, staring into the smoke. "Maybe I did," he muttered. That day, Dwight H. Johnson became a legend, the one-man army of Vietnam. He didn't fight for medals or pride. He fought because no one else could, because in the middle of that burning field, someone had to stand between life and death and refuse to move. But war doesn't end when the shooting stops. And for Dwight, the hardest battles were still waiting. Not in Vietnam, but in the silence that followed him home. When Dwight H. Johnson returned from Vietnam, he wasn't the same man who had left Detroit a year earlier. He came home carrying a medal that shimmered in the light, the Medal of Honor, the nation's highest award for valor. But behind that gold star and blue ribbon, there was a darkness that no ceremony could ever erase. He received his medal from President Lyndon B. Johnson in the spring of 1969. Cameras flashed. The president shook his hand. Military officials called him a true American hero. But when the applause faded, Dwight's eyes wandered. He didn't see the White House or the polished floors or the proud smiles. He saw flames. He smelled smoke. He heard the echo of screams from Pleiku. In that moment, he looked more lost than proud. When reporters asked him what it felt like to be a hero, he said quietly, "I just did what I had to do." Back in Detroit, they tried to celebrate him, a parade, a handshake, a few newspaper articles. But parades didn't pay bills, and pride didn't fill a fridge. Dwight found himself back where he started, in a struggling neighborhood with memories that wouldn't leave him alone. He found work at a Chrysler plant, surrounded by the hum of machinery that reminded him of the engines he once trusted to save his life. But even there, in the noise of the factory, he couldn't escape the sound of gunfire. His mother said he woke up some nights shouting, sweating, sometimes crying. He'd lost his temper easily, drank too much, and withdrew from everyone. He didn't talk about the war, not the firefight, not the medal, not the men he lost. When someone brought it up, he'd change the subject or just leave the room. He told one friend, "People call you a hero, but they don't understand what that really means. Heroes die. The rest of us just keep remembering." Doctors today would call it post-traumatic stress disorder, but back then, no one had a name for it. They just called it combat fatigue and expected men like Dwight to tough it out. So he did, until he couldn't anymore. Money got tight, his car broke down, he had a young family to feed. And the weight of that medal, that symbol of courage, it began to feel like a curse. It reminded him of everything he'd lost, every man who didn't make it home. He once told a fellow veteran, "That medal, it's heavy, man, heavier than any tank I ever drove." He was restless, angry at the system that had used him, honored him, then forgotten him. He wanted to make sense of it all, to be more than a name on a piece of paper. But the country had moved on. America was tired of the Vietnam War. The protests had grown louder than the parades. Soldiers were no longer heroes. They were reminders of a war everyone wanted to forget. And so, Dwight Johnson, the one-man army, the living legend, started to fade from memory. He worked long hours, spent nights alone, and felt more and more invisible with each passing day. The man who once charged into gunfire now struggled to walk into a grocery store without feeling his chest tighten. He tried to stay strong for his family, for his son, for the image of the man people thought he was. But inside, the war never stopped. Sometimes he'd stare at his medal, still in its case, and whisper, "What was it all for?" He'd sit in silence, his hands trembling, his mind drifting back to that burning field in Vietnam, where everything he was and everything he lost still waited for him. By 1971, just 3 years after his act of heroism, Dwight was living quietly in Detroit. He'd gained weight, lost his spark, but the people who knew him said the same thing. He still had that look in his eyes, the look of a man who'd seen too much and never found his way back. The story of Dwight H. Johnson wasn't supposed to end in tragedy, but fate and the wounds of war had other plans. By the spring of 1971, Dwight H. Johnson was no longer the man the nation had once called a hero. He still carried the Medal of Honor, but it had become a relic of another life, a life that didn't feel like his anymore. The days in Detroit were gray and heavy. The city that had once promised work and dignity now felt cold and unforgiving. Every day he woke up to the sound of car engines at the Chrysler plant, and every day, for a brief moment, he thought he was back in Vietnam, the thrum of metal echoing the sound of tank engines rolling through jungle mud. He tried to be normal, he really did. He smiled for his co-workers, played with his young son, tried to fit into a world that had no idea what war did to a man's soul. But inside, Dwight was falling apart. The nightmares were constant. The faces of the men he couldn't save came back every night. The smell of burning diesel, the sound of screaming, they never left him. The war followed him everywhere, like a ghost that refused to let go. Some nights he'd walk the streets alone, coat collar turned up, eyes staring at nothing. People would recognize him sometimes. Hey, that's the guy who won the Medal of Honor. But he'd just nod and keep walking. He didn't feel like that man anymore. In truth, he didn't even know who that man was. In the summer, his marriage began to fracture. The arguments, the long silences, the drinking. He wasn't violent, but he was angry. At the system, at the war, at himself. He felt forgotten by the country he'd risked his life for. He'd visit the VA office, hoping for help, but came home with more paperwork than answers. He once told a friend, "You fight for your country, but when you come home, you have to fight to live in it." In April of 1971, everything began to unravel. The bills piled up. He fell behind on his car payments. The Chrysler job wasn't steady anymore, and the pride he once had in his work was gone. On April 30th, he got into his car and drove to a nearby liquor store in Detroit. What happened next would remain one of the saddest mysteries in the history of the Vietnam generation. Witnesses said Dwight walked in quietly, wearing a jacket, his eyes distant. He wasn't shouting, he wasn't angry, just quiet. He looked around for a moment, maybe lost, maybe desperate, and then, for reasons no one fully understood, he pulled out a gun. The clerk froze. Dwight's hand trembled. It wasn't clear if he wanted to rob the store or if something inside him simply broke. The police arrived quickly. There was shouting, confusion, and within seconds, gunfire. Dwight H. Johnson, the Medal of Honor hero, the man who once faced a company of North Vietnamese soldiers alone, was shot and killed on the floor of that Detroit store. He was 27 years old. When the news hit the papers, the headlines were cruelly simple. Medal of Honor, winner killed in robbery attempt. But the truth was far more complicated. Those who knew him said he didn't die robbing a store. He died fighting the same war he had been fighting since 1968, the war inside his own mind. His funeral was small, no grand speeches, a folded flag, a few words about courage and sacrifice. His mother wept silently. A handful of veterans came in uniform, saluted his coffin, and said nothing. They understood. They knew what it meant to come home in body, but never in spirit. Later, one of his friends said, "Dwight didn't die in Detroit. He died in Vietnam. It just took a few years for his body to catch up." Even the Army later recognized that his end wasn't an act of crime. It was the final chapter of a soldier who had given everything. He had fought beyond the battlefield, against memories no one could see, and lost. Years later, when people spoke his name, they remembered the legend, the one-man army. The man who charged alone into enemy fire, who pulled his brothers from burning tanks, who refused to give up even when surrounded. But those who looked deeper saw something more. They saw the story of every soldier who returned home carrying a weight too heavy for one life to bear. Dwight Johnson's story isn't just about heroism, it's about the cost of it. It's about what happens when the medals fade, When the crowds go home and when the silence becomes louder than the gunfire ever was. He remains buried among heroes, a quiet soldier who fought harder than most, both on the battlefield and off it. And maybe that's what true courage really is, not the charge into danger, but the fight to keep living afterward. Even now, decades later, when historians speak his name, they don't just remember the man who faced an army alone. They remember the man who proved that even heroes can break and that their stories deserve to be told. Because Dwight H. Johnson wasn't just a soldier, he was a man, brave, flawed, human. And though he lost his final battle, his legend endures, a reminder that behind every medal is a price, and behind every hero, a heart that once beat just like ours.